Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this discussion. I'm Catherine Lotriante. I currently am serving as a senior researcher at Georgetown University and a non-resident senior associate at CSIS. I have the pleasure today of serving as the moderator for this panel discussion titled The Cyberspace Solarium Commission, What is Left to be Done? The Cyberspace Solarium Commission was established in 2019 in the National Defense Authorization Act. Its mandate was to develop a consensus on a strategic approach to defending the United States in cyberspace against cyber attacks of significant consequences. The co-chairs of the commission were Senator Angus King and Representative Mike Gallagher, along with 8 commissioners, including Frank Cilluffo, who is here joining us today on the panel. The commission presented its final report to the public on March 11, 2020. The report had over 80 recommendations tied to its proposed strategy of layered cyber deterrence. 25 of those recommendations have been codified into law. The National Defense Authorization Act of 2021 reauthorized the commission to collect and assess feedback on the analysis and recommendations contained within its final report. Also, to review the implementation of its recommendations and complete some of the activities originally set forth for the commission. Since then, there have been a number of white papers that have been released by the commission on topics such as ICT supply chain, the federal cyber workforce, and the cybersecurity lessons from the pandemic, which also included additional new recommendations. I would like to briefly introduce our panelists in the order that they will speak today, providing us with their unique perspectives on the commission's work. All 3 of these panelists are truly cyber veterans and have extensive government experience and diverse perspectives, which should provide plenty of food for thought today. First, as I mentioned, Frank Cilluffo is joining us. He was one of the commissioners of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. He also is the director of Auburn University's McCreary Institute for Cyber and Critical Infrastructure Security. He previously served as the special assistant to President George W. Bush for Homeland Security immediately following the 9/11 attacks against the US. Next, we'll hear from Paul Rosenzweig. Paul also has had extensive experience in the federal government, including formerly serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Homeland Security. Paul currently is a senior fellow at R Street. Last, but certainly not least, is Tom Corcoran. Tom is one of those cyber guys that was cool before the cybers were cool. He formerly served as a staffer on the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, and he worked for the Department of Defense. Currently, Tom is the head of cybersecurity at Farmers Insurance. Frank, if I would ask you to please kick off the conversations, maybe framing the work of the commission for us, talking a little bit about the detailed recommendations, and then possibly giving us some insight into the legislation. I'd like to return to you, Frank, once Paul and Tom have spoken, so maybe we can get some of your personal opinions, views, likes or dislikes, if you can share them with us, about some of the recommendations in the work of the commission. So Frank, over to you, and thank you all 3 of you for joining us.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Catherine. Real privilege and pleasure as always to be on a panel with you and 2 good friends, Paul and Tom. So this should be lots of fun. Let me start with sort of stepping back a little bit. As you mentioned very aptly, 25, it's actually 27 provisions of our initial recommendations were codified into law. So pretty significant impact first go around, but we're by no means running a victory lap at this point. I mean, first and foremost, we need to make sure that some of those recommendations are being acted upon. And the intent behind some of those recommendations are moving in the right direction. And secondly, we need to make sure that the resources are backing up some of those recommendations. The old adage, policy without resources is rhetoric. We need to make sure that we're funding some of these initiatives as well as hopefully pointing us in the right direction from a policy perspective. So that's our first order of business. Subsequently, we have about 30 primary recommendations we're advancing this fiscal year. And because we came out of the National Defense Authorization Act, that was obviously the primary vehicle we looked at to last year. This year, we obviously recognize that cyber goes far beyond national security. So we need to make sure that there are other congressional vehicles, committees, and other approaches to be able to implement some of our recommendations and provisions. I thought I'd just touch on a couple that I think are most important. You'll see a lot of emphasis this year on translating the nouns into the verbs in terms of public-private partnerships. We've all been around this discussion for decades. I think we've all written books, reports, papers, testified on this particular issue. But what we want to be able to do is translate some of those nouns into verbs to really have practical, pragmatic, and operational impact. So one of the first recommendations we're looking at is establishing a joint collaborative environment. We're calling it JCE for short. This is to actually bring the private sector not as a secondary afterthought, but to actually have a seat at the table in terms of implementing some of our operations and implementing some of our cyber defense measures. Much more on that. Happy to touch on that during Q&A as well. We're also looking to designate what we're calling systemically critical infrastructure. Awful acronym, SICI, but the acronym is what it is. The idea is to make sure that our genuine lifeline sectors, not all critical infrastructures are equally critical. U.S. government, DHS in particular, good work has designated 17 sectors to be critical, but some from a lifeline perspective are even more critical than others. And as such, we need to establish both burdens and benefits to some of those that are going to have a more significant public-private partnership to be able to focus our efforts on. And we all know what those lifeline sectors are, but I'm happy to jump into that in greater detail later. But third, and I'm happy to say that we asked for a cyber state of distress, which was really looking at a whole new set of issues around continuity of the economy. So the old COOP and COG programs of government, we thought we needed to bring into a private sector domain as well. And in that, we are calling for a cyber response fund. So think of natural disasters, think of the need to be able to have to backstop our state, local, tribal, and territorial partners in a cyber event. So a significant incident, the state and local clearly do not have the same wherewithal and resources that the federal government does, and happy to touch on that in greater depth as well. Another big recommendation is standing up the Cyber Diplomacy Act. This was a bit of legislation that Congressman McCall and Congressman Langevin and others were supporting on the House right now. And that's to elevate State Department's role to an ambassador role and to a bureau role to better fit into the broader interagency sets of issues around cyber. This is not about ceding our national interest. It's actually about empowering it so we can work with our allies to be able to better push back on Huawei or ZTE or Kaspersky, and I can go on that as well. And I'll just leave really quickly three more just because they're important to me. One is a data breach notification law. We need to make sure that we have the reporting structures in place in terms of a breach. This has been around for decades, but I think there's finally awareness that we need to be able to move forward on law there. And then two more are around supply chain, just because it's an area I've spent a lot of time on. And I chaired an effort for DHS on economic security that also zeroed in on some of these issues. So we're calling for a National Supply Chain Intelligence Center. And again, this is not just the feds. This is actually integrating with the private sector. Know yourself, know your enemy. And we don't have visibility across our supply chain as we'd like right now. And finally, we're also calling for a National Security Investment Corporation. So there are a lot of loopholes in terms of early stage funding and the like, where issues of concern from foreign investment need to be addressed. So I've never had an unspoken thought. I went on way too long, but I could go on for so much longer, but I'll stop there, Catherine. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Frank. Paul, on to you. What are your favorite recommendations or least favorite? And what do you predict in this space?
I think that it's imperative at this point to be a little more, be narrowly focused on what's really important going forward. The NDAA is a great vehicle, but most of the remaining recommendations, unfortunately, fall more or less outside of it. And depending upon how the Senate parliamentarian, feels that morning after breakfast, you may or may not be able to get some things in there. So for my money, we're going to have to pick and choose a few of the really important ones. And I won't repeat or second any of the ones that Frank said simply because he's covered them all. Rather, for the next couple of minutes, I want to talk about one that he didn't mention that is, to my mind, essential, and that I hope will be a singular focus of Congress. The creation of a Bureau of Cyber Statistics, where the commission has recommended it be in the Department of Commerce. I'm pretty much agnostic as to the where. I'm pretty much agnostic as to the structure, whether it's a singular agency or it has 3 heads, how it's funded. All those things can be answered, but they're less important, I think, than the idea of actually sitting down and doing it. To my mind, our biggest problem in cybersecurity right now is that, to put it in my elevator speech voice, cybersecurity is an art, not a science. And that's because we can tell you qualitatively what we think works. We can talk about, it's better to have passwords than not, and 2-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication is good, but we can't tell you how good. And if I gave you $5 million and said, spend this on improving the security of an enterprise, the average CISO couldn't actually put numbers to a proposal to decide whether or not to do threat hunting or better training of employees. We probably think better training of employees would work, but we can't numericize that in ways that are really effective. To my mind, that needs to change if we're going to actually have a significant effort to systematize America's approach to cybersecurity. And the Bureau of Cyber Statistics is likely to be a venue for creating those types of metrics, creating first agreement on what the metrics might be or how to develop them, and then about how to implement them. From my perspective, metrics would be useful at least 3 different levels. One of them is the one that Frank has already mentioned, which is simply incident response and counting. It boggles my mind that 15 years into this cyber security crisis, pretty much since 2005, 2006, we still don't have an operating picture of how frequently and what sorts of breaches occur in the United States. We're doing better than we did 15 years ago, but without a comprehensive breach notification law, we simply will never get a sense of what's actually happening on the ground, and that makes it impossible to do trend analysis or gap analysis with any efficacy. But even that is doing better now than my kind of other 2 ideas, or that I believe will be, the commission has put on the plate for the Bureau of Cyber Statistics. One is what I would call network cyber hygiene metrics. That is large-scale metrics about what's happening at the top level of the network, how frequently we see bad traffic, where it's sourcing from, what sorts of techniques, TTPs, the bad guys are using at a bulk level. It was a surprise to us, a strategic surprise to us, the transition to ransomware in the bad guys' panoply of activities, in the last 5 years. But that would have been no surprise had we been paying better attention to the signals, the antecedent signals for that before, and we simply had no way of measuring it. And then the third bucket that I would love to see the Bureau of Cyber Statistics work on is kind of the tweener stuff, enterprise metrics. How do we measure the security of a particular enterprise? And that's going to be critical in the end if we're ever going to get to a a place where we can actually differentiate and say that company A is doing a better job than company B, and that ought to be reflected in pricing, insurance, security efforts, the assistance they get from government, all sorts of things would flow from that. And right now, that's a blank space pretty much, certainly in the public domain. There are some products out there that are proprietary, but they're not transparent. And the ultimate goal here for me is to have metrics that are transparent, accountable, auditable, effective, generally agreed upon, widely used, and scalable. And we're nowhere near that right now. And for me, the single most significant unaddressed commission recommendation is the creation of a Bureau of Cyber Statistics, which would be the first step on the road to what I consider to be the holy grail, which is getting to a point where cybersecurity is like bridge safety. You can put a number on it, or at least a range of numbers that is better than, it's better than it used to be. I could talk about many other recommendations, but like Frank, I've probably gone on far too long. And so I will recede and talk to some of the others later, but I'll turn it over to you and to Tom.
Paul, thanks. Thank you very much. And we will return to some of these. So, Tom, let's hear from you. From your perspective, you've had experience on the Hill in the past, but you've also seen things from the executive branch. Of the recommendation, do you have one that for you is most important or top of your mind, most effective in solving some of the problems? What are you thinking?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I would say that actually the two that struck me most in the report are probably most colored by my private sector experience. And they were both sort of alluded to by Paul and Frank, but I'd go a little deeper on them. The first is that, that national data protection and data breach law that the report calls for. And while I would say data breach is important, for all the reasons that Frank and Paul suggested, I would also add to it that companies that operate nationally in the US, every time they have an issue, they have to do a 50-state analysis of what's required of them. And so setting a national standard would certainly make things a lot easier for American companies, and especially for companies that don't have the resources to have a big regulatory team to figure that out, would make their lives a lot easier. And also, it's a fairness issue that why do citizens of state A get very little protection and visibility into what happens, whereas, state B, they get incredibly rich details and maybe even like a private right of action to deal with an issue of negligence that impacts their privacy. And so I think spreading that equally across all the US, I think would be a good idea. Also, I think maybe setting some standards while we're at it that all companies should meet, a minimum bar. As an insurance company, the company I work for is subject, and we're licensed in the state of New York, so we're subject to the New York Department of Financial Services regulation, and it's a fantastic regulation. It was a great conversation between the state of New York and all the companies that would be impacted by it. The first draft wasn't great, but after a lot of conversations, we got to something that's not only very sort of straightforward to comply with. It's also actually a standard that any company should reasonably meet. And why should only insurance companies and banks be subject to that kind of regulation, right? I think most companies should be subject to that kind of regulation if they're handling customer data or they provide a service that people are paying for. Anyway, so I think obviously that's going to be a really tough trick for Congress to pull off, but I think it's something they should get done. I also am a big fan of the joint collaborative environment that's called for in the report. I would probably, though, although it talks about private public partnerships in there, I would probably set the fulcrum closer to the private sector side of the balance in terms of what needs to be done. The private sector has most of the tools it needs. It just doesn't always have the right information. And I would say that the average company doesn't have the resources to dive into the details of a cyber threat and tune their tools to meet the threat. They're relying on what I would call black box service from a big enterprise provider like Cisco or Palo Alto to deal with that. And so I would like to see the government providing more real-time threat intelligence to those companies. They could automatically feed it into their tools. Now, maybe not in real time, but in a matter of nanoseconds, they could get that protection. We already have a good running start on that with an institution called the Cyber Threat Alliance. It's a private sector organization where a bunch of companies have gotten together and cyber providers have gotten together and decided that the actual threat information is a commodity, and they're not going to sell their products based on differentiations of their threat intelligence. It's the way they provide that service, how fast they act on it, how well they integrate with other tools. That should be the competition space, not the threat intelligence itself. And so right now, it's mostly just information being shared between those big sort of high-end cyber threat providers. But I would love to see information from DHS and NSA being washed through that and being provided so that, down on the streets, with Farmers Intelligence, I don't need to know where the information came from, right? I just need to know that, my Palo Alto provider believes that it's good information and blocks that threat as a result. And I don't care whether it came from one of their competitors or came from NSA or from one of NSA's sort of European allies, as long as I get that information fast. And I don't even really know sort of why they blocked it. Just that, hey, this is a threat. We blocked it. Have a nice day.
Tom, if I can pick up on that very recommendation from the commission, return to Frank with it, but also hear from both of you on this. And Paul, I don't think you brought it up, but I'd love to kind of put you on the spot to have you think about it. And that's the joint collaborative environment that you've talked about, because as many people, most recently, probably one of the things that's been on everyone's mind, of course, is the SolarWinds incident. And there's been discussion around that incident and some proposals by the former NSA's former general counsel, one of them, and others, about the creation of a new center. Tom, you mentioned you'd like to lean more on the government in that environment, providing information to the private sector. From what I've read in open sources on SolarWinds, it was the private sector that had the information, came to the government and notified them. So if we could talk a little bit about, maybe Frank, tell us a little bit how the commission viewed this environment, how it would have been different than anything we've done before. That environment might turn out to be something different than what the commission envisioned, maybe. But then the big question to all of you, if that was in place before SolarWinds, would things have been different? Right? Would we have had a different outcome months earlier, potentially, on just that one of the most recent, incidents?
Catherine, so I'll just jump in quickly. I mean, my thinking is very consistent with where Paul and Tom were in terms of the JCE, the Joint Collaborative Cyber Environment. And at the end of the day, we're talking about the same question we've had, and that's tasking collection priorities. So at the end of the day, this would allow, as long as there are burdens as well as benefits to companies that could actually absorb information. Again, you can scrub it of sources and methods. To Tom's point, you don't need to know precisely who, what, where, when, how, but you need to know that this is actually important. This is something we need to be moving on. And that is the thinking behind the JCE sets of recommendations going forward, is where there would actually be a cloud-enabled environment that would be the pooling of different resources and information. So all things said and done, easier said than done. I mean, the reality is there are all sorts of authorities, and there's a reason we haven't answered this question for quite some time. It's not easy. You also need to make sure that we take the privacy considerations very seriously, and there are a whole host of issues that need to be tackled. That said, we can't continue to punt on second down. I can understand punting on fourth down when it's 4th and 10, but we've been punting this ball for way too long right now. And if you ask me, that's what I meant by translating the nouns into the verbs. I think we've admired the problem. We've diagnosed what needs to be done. Once we start getting into the solution set, it's going to be a little clumsy. It's probably going to change, but that's where the action will actually be to have, I think, significant impact and outcomes. So I think we're speaking on the same sheet of music there. One, and I'll stop on that one. But I have a bunch of other items that, if there's time, I'd be happy to bring up. But that's a great point.
Yeah, Frank, we definitely want to come back to you. Let me bug you, Paul, for a second. Speaking on that, the joint collaborative environment, what sorts of potentially new authorities might we have to envision if we want this to come to fruition and work?
Well, I mean, I think that's a great question, and honestly, though I am encouraged by the inclusion of the JCE in the Commission's recommendations, I think that the way we're structured now, it's almost impossible to implement it, and it's going to take a really significant rethinking of how we share information. There's a reason why all of our prior efforts at threat and vulnerability information sharing have failed or have been less than fully successful in this environment. And it's simply because, or not simply, but it is clearly because we have a necessity for rapid, agile distribution of information that is fundamentally inconsistent with the structure of our governance systems, right? I mean, the Commission rightly called for an information sharing environment that has speed and agility. That's a direct. Those are two words that will never be said about any federal agency or any governmental agency. And I don't mean that in a mean way, maybe a little bit in a mean way, but I don't really mean it in a mean way. I mean it as a statement of reality that our hierarchical system of governance in the federal system and in the state systems is built around limitations on speed and ability as a proxy for accountability and oversight. And to date, that has hamstrung our ability to move information quickly to the private sector. The centralizing instincts that come from, the Commission suggested that perhaps the JCE would be in CISA or somewhere like that. That's going to necessarily mean that there'll be all sorts of structures and authorities that come with CISA that will slow things down. From my perspective, when you ask what authorities do we need, I would say that the right way to do a JCE of this sort would be to completely construct a purpose-built entity, not subservient to any other institution, right? And in which the government is a seat at the table that is no different in terms of authority to add, subtract, multiply, or divide information from it than from the private sector, that had a separate, small, nimble, kind of Silicon Valley, agile developments type executive secretariat for the creation of new and different ways of information sharing, test them out, they fail, move on, try another one. That's the type of structured environment that we are capable of creating, that the Global Cyber Alliance is sort of creating, but even there it's a structured environment because of the large size of the institutions involved that would really be effective. I honestly don't think we have the political will for that. But if we did, it could really be effective. It could be a real-time game changer. And so I love the Commission, and certainly with Frank here, I don't want to say anything bad about the Commission, but this is one where the instinct to do something is going to run hard up into the reality of no, we can't in the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives or the Senate, something like that.
So we have two that seem a little more optimistic, one less optimistic. Tom, I don't know if you want to, before we maybe pick up on another recommendation, Tom, did you want to add anything else? Because you raised the collaborative environment as something that you thought would be helpful.
I don't reject Paul's idea of a government startup to do this, but I think there's already some great tools in the toolbox. I think CISA already has a fantastic relationship with the private sector and is already providing a lot of value. The problem is it often comes in the form of an email with a lot of technical data that either companies can't consume quickly or at all. And I'd like to see it, maybe it's a little bit of authority for them to build a pipe between them and, say, for example, the Cyber Threat Alliance, and agreed on data standard and agree on some way to wash the data once it gets, because the Cyber Threat Alliance is already, 99% private sector information being shared between sort of, the upper echelon of cyber threat providers. And so if you add another 5% of, sort of high fidelity threat information that in the data state that they can consume and push out to their tools to all their customers, I think we can probably get there pretty quick without a whole lot of legislation, maybe even just a little bit of, executive action.
Apologies.
Hey, Catherine.
Alliances, the Global Cyber Alliance and the Cyber Threat Alliance, both great institutions, but it's the.
And I'm
Frank,
going to throw one more institution in there because there's also the Analysis and Resilience Center for Systemic Risk, which used to be the Financial Services, the FSARC, now includes the biggest companies in the biggest sectors. Here's the reality from my perspective. I'm not speaking on behalf as a commissioner right now, but information sharing and intelligence programs work if there's giving and taking. In other words, if you're only in receive mode and you're not providing, that's doomed for failure. The biggest impediment in my eyes is trust. It takes years to build and nanoseconds to lose. So I think the way that I am proposing, and again, I'm not speaking on behalf of the commission here, is to sort of take that ARC mindset to the JC environment where you have companies that could actually absorb the information and know what to do with it. And oh, by the way, they just have very important information to provide as well. And I'm glad you both brought up the Cyber Threat Alliance. I think that's a great model. That ought to be part of it. But I just needed to throw the ARC in there because not everyone could absorb some of the capacity and the wherewithal that could be brought to bear. Quite honestly, it's more of a burden than it is a benefit.
so let me go back to you, Frank, on if you had your wishes, is there anything that didn't get picked up by the commission and the follow-on work that you think is still missing? That, maybe at the time there was a lack of a consensus on the commission, or it just wasn't top of mind, or because of more recent issues like SolarWinds, you have thought a little more about it. And that can be for Paul and Tom as well. Is there anything that of all the recommendations, is there still something that maybe we haven't thought about?
Well, firstly, I'm clearly biased in terms of what's missing. So I'm probably not the best person to ask on that. But one thing that gets lost, I think, in a lot of our discussion about the commission is the strategy itself. I mean, at the end of the day, we need to make sure that all the various instruments of statecraft can be brought to bear. And quite honestly, there are a lot of people who poo-poo cyber deterrence. I think that we're talking about their straw men. At the end of the day, you don't deter cyber, you deter actors from engaging in cyber. So I think getting to the point where we can impose cost and consequence on bad behavior, we can work with our allies, and we can actually lean a little forward. We're never going to simply firewall our way out of the problem. So at the end of the day, there's a governance issue. I think the stand-up of the National Cyber Director will help with that. And I couldn't think of a better individual than Chris Inglis, will hopefully be confirmed quickly by the Senate to act on that. One thing that I also, which didn't get a whole lot of attention that I think is also equally important, is victims. So we're calling for a National Cybercrime Victim Assistance and Recovery Center. I mean, at the end of the day, I spend my time thinking about advanced persistent threats, Russia, China. But most of the incidents people are dealing with are going to be ransomware incidents at the state, local, tribal, and territorial level. So we need to have recourse and opportunities and tools that can be brought to the victims that are getting fleeced day in, day out, especially the elderly and those that are not technically savvy. So I think that's a big area. And then just because I'm on the law enforcement, we ask for doubling the cyber liaison, the ALATs and the FBI. We need more of them. They're worth their weight in gold, because at the end of the day, if you look at SolarWinds, US servers were exploited here. So if you reverse engineer and do an autopsy on these cases, we have real hard questions we as a country need to come to grips with if we start talking about what could truly stop a SolarWinds going forward.
That's great. Your last point, actually, we could spend a whole day talking and dissecting just SolarWinds, but that should be for another panel or another whole day. But Paul and Tom, as we're reaching close, we have a few minutes left, or actually a second left. Last words, last comments.
Yeah, I would say that the report does a good job talking about bringing together all the sort of elements of national power. And as I was reading it, I was thinking that I'd like to see almost the level of effort that we brought to counterterrorism to tackling the ransomware threat. These folks hide in dark corners of the world outside of the reach of law enforcement, and I'd almost like to see that same intelligence, special forces, maybe even covert action brought to bear to root these folks out, because the level of damage they bring to our economy is tremendous. Akin to what we could potentially face from terrorism. I think it's worth dealing with that same level of seriousness.
Paul, final words, thoughts?
I think the commission did a great job. There's very little that it didn't leave on the table. I would say the only area that I would like to see the commission move into, or another commission move into, is the related cybersecurity adjacent question of social disinformation, and the perniciousness of that. It isn't strictly speaking a cybersecurity problem, and therefore, strictly speaking, probably not appropriate for the commission to have looked at or for this panel to discuss, but they are near adjacent, especially given the possibilities of obfuscation and anonymity and malicious conduct within that space that are directly related to cybersecurity issues. And so there is enough of a cognate. So maybe the next NDAA will charge the commission with going off in that direction.
Yeah, well said. Certainly something that's important and is related to cyber, as well as other areas, Paul. Well, thank you, all three of you. Thank you so much for joining the panel and for your thoughtful discussion. I'm sure we're going to get a lot of interesting questions. Hopefully, we'll all have time to respond to them. So great to see you again, all of you, and stay safe and stay well.
Thanks,
Thank
Catherine.
Thanks. Next
Thank
year
you, Catherine.
in San Francisco.
That's right. Take care.